Bay Wetlands Centre World Wetlands Day event. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dominique. I'm your host for the next hour as we take this time on a Saturday morning to talk about stormwater. I will apologise now if I head into punny water territory, but there's plenty of funny ways to talk about the water that is in our landscape. But I'd like to start first of all by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today. We might be sharing a digital space this morning, but we're each on the land of the world's oldest and continuing cultures. I join you today on the edge of Naarm, between the freshwater of the Kororoit and of the Laverton Creek, on the lands of the Bunurong people. And I am reminded that this water has nourished thousands of generations of living things and has shaped this land that has held those generations. And I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any other First Nations people that might be joining us today. If you're feeling comfortable this morning and comfortable with the technology, if you share your local waterway in the chat, it'll give us a great sense of how we're all connected together. For those of you who are just arriving as the introduction's starting, just a little bit of housekeeping to start. We only have a short hour together today, so I'll keep things moving pretty quickly. There's going to be time for questions from the wonderful audience, but while the people who are participating in our panel are speaking, if you just keep yourselves on mute, it helps with audio quality throughout the session. And the session's going to be recorded so that others can catch up afterwards. You're welcome to turn your camera off if you're more comfortable with that. And you can pop your questions into the chat throughout the session. That will be monitored by another team from the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre. And once we've heard formally from the people on our panel, we're going to pass over to the audience to ask all the interesting questions and thoughts that they're having about stormwater. The other thing is, you're more than welcome to keep your camera on throughout. I certainly like having people to talk to rather than the screen, but that's totally up to you if you're not comfortable with that. So, oh, I can see it flowing in. I can see Wathaurong country, Wurundjeri country, Darebin Creek, Waratah Bay and Bunurong country as well. Fabulous. I keep those little things popping up into the chat. It's wonderful for the people who are participating today. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We do have the chance to chat with some fabulous people about stormwater. And I think in some ways the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre is the perfect organisation to bring people together for that kind of conversation, with passionate community members, scientists and organisations who are interested in water for waterway health, but also for human health. And just like a wetland is a rich community of interconnected organisms, so too is the network around water. And today is our chance to dive into that richness and be thinking about what we can do better. So let's start with some introductions. And Beck, I might get you to spotlight the people when I'm talking about them. So I'll start with Neil Blake. He's the Port Phillip Bay keeper. And Neil has ongoing experience in government and community collaborations in a diverse range of environment topics and a firm view that the Bay's long-term health depends on the waterways that flow into it. Welcome, Neil. Thank you for joining us today. We also have Nick Olaf, who's our citizen science team leader for the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre. Nick has been active in many citizen science projects, and he's the team leader for citizen science with the Wetlands Centre. And amongst those many projects, he has had a particular involvement in gross pollutant traps in Hobsons Bay and their effectiveness in controlling litter. So welcome, Nick. Lovely to have you here. And the next person that's joining our panel today is Hi, Nick.
You can't sort of compare.
Oops, put someone else off mute. Thank you. So the next person that's joining us is Dr. Robert Walsh. He's from his own organisation, Waterlife Australia. And Robert's one of a handful of Australian freshwater scientists that owns and operates a lab that identifies the aquatic microfauna and macroinvertebrates from inland waters across Australia. We have been lucky enough in the past with Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre to hear from Robert and his amazing research into that micro life in our waterways. So hello to you. It's wonderful to have you today, Robert. We also have Darren Coughlin joining us as the Livability and Projects Officer from Greater Western Water. He has a particular passion for the environment and creating a greener, healthier and more livable climate adaptive Melbourne, and has collaborated with others to help achieve that urban greening outcomes. It's great to have you join us today, Darren. And just two more people who are on our panel. Andrew Webster, who's a senior conservation ranger from Hobsons Bay City Council. He's passionate about getting the community out and about and enjoying the 22 conservation reserves in Hobsons Bay. And his position is predominantly educating the public about biodiversity in Hobsons Bay and the outdoor world. So really at that point where the waterways are meeting together. Hi, Andrew, lovely to have you with us today. And we're very lucky to have you joining us from not too far away from Melbourne. And finally, Michael Godfrey, who is the Stormwater Regional Coordinator for Melbourne Water. He's worked at Melbourne Water since 2010, extensively with local government and industry partners, providing support for the implementation of water-sensitive urban design. That's a word that is going to, I'm going to have to concentrate when I say those words together, and particularly stormwater quality investigations and the development of wider industry tools and guidelines. Welcome. It's lovely to have you with us today, Michael, and welcome to all our panel members today. It's very exciting to be able to speak to you all and to open up a discussion with all of you. We could easily speak to each of you for an hour or more, but we just have this short hour together today. All right, well, let's get started. And there are lots of people in the room with us today. I can see we have 43 participants online. I know getting ready to host this session, had to think about stormwater and what it meant to me. And I thought it would be great for us to hear from organisations that can help us understand exactly what stormwater is and how they're connected to it in our area. So Michael, I'm going to start with you as a representative from Melbourne Water to tell us a little bit about your responsibility for stormwater in the West.
Sure. Look, and I'll be specific that I'm not directly involved in the West per se with stormwater. I work in a role where we plan. We look at the Greater Melbourne region as well. So I can give you from an organisation perspective what Melbourne Water does, and I suppose probably a good context to start with as well is actually how stormwater fits in with the urban landscape and the urban water cycle as well. And probably the first thing to really mention is that the Greater Melbourne region is quite unique in the way it manages stormwater. In many cities of the world, stormwater is often captured and treated as part of the sewage treatment system as well. But in Melbourne, in the Greater Melbourne region, it's quite unique in that the stormwater that we get from impervious or urban areas is actually disconnected. When I say disconnected, it's not connected to the sewage system. They're two fundamentally different systems. The sewage obviously going to sewage treatment plants, it gets treated, either released or that recycled water reused back into industry or across the across our region. Stormwater has historically been a separate system. In the Melbourne context, it's historically been seen as what we term a drained city. So as Melbourne grew, stormwater obviously was a bit of an issue around flooding per se. And often the objective was to get rid of it, to obviously help protect human safety and obviously values in terms of property and such. So for many years, it was actually seen as a drained solution. We get rid of stormwater as quickly as we can, hence the idea that we have lots of pipes in our urban areas, we have lots of pits, and the idea is just to get the water as quickly to the nearest drainage area, often the local waterway, which fundamentally will end up in the bays. And in the Melbourne Water context, that encompasses both the Port Phillip region and also the Western Port region as well. And what's tended to happen is probably in sort of like the early 90s towards early 2000s as well, there's a lot of research starting to recognise that stormwater shouldn't just be sort of a nuisance problem that we can deal with. It's something where it could actually become a valued resource as well. And in terms of looking at it from a resource perspective, it can also help in terms of meeting some environmental objectives and that. And fundamentally, when we drain a city, that water hits the waterways, it really can damage the ecology and the receiving environments quite substantially, both in terms of the volume of stormwater that runs off impervious areas, and in a Melbourne context, it's a big city and it's growing really, really quickly. So it's an emerging problem. But it's both the volume of stormwater that actually is discharged. With that, of course, is a range of contaminants and pollutants that is carried with as well, which often ends up in our environment. And probably another key area of research which we're starting to recognise is the frequency of runoff that actually hits both waterways, which eventually hits the bays as well. And that frequency of runoff, which is very, very quick, it's much more frequent than it would be for what would happen in a rural or a forested landscape, effectively doesn't give any of those receiving environments, be the bugs and the animals and the vegetation in some of the waterways that are across our region, it doesn't give them a chance to ever recover. So they're continually getting lots of small, every time it rains, even small rainfall events, there's a really fast discharge of water into those waterways, and they're often in a cycle in what we call a degraded stream state. And once they hit a certain threshold, often it's very hard to get them to recover and to restore the state they were in before urbanisation actually occurred. So it's not just Melbourne Water, we're working with a lot of other stakeholders across the region. Some of the main players are in this room right now, and community as well, to try and get a better understanding of how we deal with stormwater, and to look at it more as a resource and look at that it can be a beneficial avenue for us to help both the livability of people within the Melbourne region, but also fundamentally as well. Very much from Melbourne Water, there's a whole part of the business looking at how can we actually protect the environment as well. So it's a solutions-based way of doing things. I'll profess it's not easy. We're trying to sort of rewrite history in a way and actually change the way that we fundamentally design landscapes and manage urban flows that come off those landscapes as well. So there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of planning. It should be underpinned by good research and regulation as well. So we're sort of slowly moving into that direction. The industry as such has been growing very, very quickly, but compared to other parts of the water cycle, be it looking at potable supply and the sewage systems, it's probably what we consider the younger cousin. It's an area which is still growing as such, whereas the other parts of the water cycle system are very well established right across the world. So stormwater is still very much an emerging area, and we're trying to keep pace with what the reality is out on the ground in terms of urban development and what it means for community and what it means for the environment too. So I suppose as a starter, that's what I can provide.
Great. And I think it's a really interesting point, actually, saying that it's an emerging area as a resource. You can see that reflected in our landscape. So the fact that our houses backed onto waterways, those smaller waterways in the past, they weren't something that we focused on as street frontage. They were something that we had to hide behind our fences. And I think also the language and the structure of those waterways as well. So the concreting of them to move water more effectively out of that hard urbanised area or industrialised area, and also calling them a drain. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to see that it's not just, I think from a community perspective as well, it's an issue to be dealt with in the past, but we're turning to face it more and more frequently. Thanks for that, Michael.
No worries, no worries.
We're going to hand over to you now, Darren, and Greater Western Water as a different element of the water cycle, I guess, and also about authority for waterways in our area. Can you tell us a little bit about Greater Western's role and how stormwater fits into that?
Thanks, Dominique. Hi, everyone. Look, I spent 12 years at Melbourne Water before going to City West Water, now Greater Western Water. And my role at Melbourne Water was operations and maintenance, so in the Werribee catchment. So a lot of stormwater drains with lots of litter going directly into waterways, which was always a bugbear of mine. And the idea of trying to be motivated to see how we could find solutions to curb the amount of rubbish and debris going straight into waterways. Some of the concepts that changed were new developments, having constructed wetlands to capture some of these stormwater events, putting it through a series of constructed wetland ponds to treat the water, to also collect the sediment from reducing the nutrients going into the bay. Long story short, I went across to City West Water in 2013 to help coordinate their Greening the West initiative. And I realised the bigger picture is Green the West is about collaboration with all the councils in the West to link everyone together to try and find solutions in regards to climate change mitigation, water management, and also I call it blue-green infrastructure, to help some of the water engineers at work understand why water is valuable in the environment. And as a part of City West Water's commitment, or Greater Western Water's commitment to greening the West, we put up a funding mechanism for $12 million to help councils set up stormwater harvesting projects. It cost around $1 to $2 million a unit, but it's around diverting stormwater from drains and wetlands during a high flow event to put that water into underground storage, which is now available as a standard mechanism through companies like City Green, Frankishy. There's a number of systems. They're like milk crates, but they're underground storage, and they can hold up to a megalitre of stormwater or more. You can add to the size of the capacity. One, for example, is Lavender Creek in Hobsons Bay, is probably the closest to the base for Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre. It's Lavender Creek, and it was when I was at Melbourne Water, it was a pretty horrible section of creek. It was a weedy horse paddock, adjusted to some landowner who had horses in it, and it was full of all sorts of weeds. In 2016, there was a project with Hobsons Bay. They realigned the creek and turned it into a series of wetlands, or a wetland system. And the idea was to divert that water in a high flow event to provide irrigation water to sports ovals at Hobsons Bay. Like, fantastic initiative. And then with the Stormwater Harvesting Fund in 2000, that was around about the year 2010, 2018, City West Water put up stormwater harvesting funding, and the Melbourne Baseball Centre applied to tap into that system that was connecting to Hobsons Bay sports ovals, and they just got turned on last year. So they're now irrigating their turf with stormwater rather than precious drinking water. So to me, it's around climate change adaptation. It's around substituting precious drinking water for a valuable resource, as in stormwater, and to work collaboratively with partners, mainly councils, to help them fund localised stormwater projects to actually irrigate green open spaces. We know in the western suburbs that in the hot summer, our parks and gardens will dry out without irrigation. And what we're trying to do is adapt to a changing climate, substituting precious drinking water for stormwater, localised, based on DELP's integrated stormwater management framework, which was set up in, I think, 2017. And the idea is they're trying to lead the game in stormwater, and water utilities like City West Water, Southeast, Melbourne Water is probably the guru at driving stormwater projects. We're following. And I think we're doing a pretty good job at City West Water, or Greater Western Water. Got to keep changing the name. Because what we're doing is demonstrating on-ground, localised stormwater harvesting projects, and the volumes of water that we're substituting that would be normally drinking water for irrigation is huge. It's in the megalitre status, and that's dollar savings to customers as well.
Right.
And I just think it's been a great thing to be a part of Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre, because what they're about to do is hopefully provide a great source of education to the community around stormwater, wetlands, and waterway health.
Yes, fabulous. Thanks for sharing that, Darren. I think it's really interesting to understand that Greater Western Water, who provides our drinking water essentially, but also agricultural water, is thinking differently about that resource that does come through stormwater, and empowering communities through councils to fund projects to come up with solutions for that water. That's great. So we've started at the bigger level, the catchment sort of level stuff with Melbourne Water, and we've narrowed that down a little bit with Greater Western Water and the idea of the water retailers and how they're contributing. And I'm going to ask now Andrew from Hobsons Bay City Council to talk about how stormwater is seen, and the impacts that it has most locally in our community.
Thanks, Dom, and thanks to Michael and Darren. I'm going to be able to keep mine really short because pretty well hit the nail on the head there. The main word I picked up from both of them was the benefits of stormwater. Like, historically, it was just something to get rid of, whereas now there's benefits of it. Now, being part of the conservation team at Hobsons Bay Council, we don't have a lot of influence or say in how the water gets into our wetlands. Where we become involved in is actually looking after some of these wetlands, whether we physically do it with our own in-house teams or get contractors out to kill weeds and revegetate around the side, things like that. But then there's also the educational side of it, and in particular, highlighting the benefits of the wetlands. And Darren sort of touched on it, that, aside from the irrigation purposes and that sort of stuff, like for the baseball ground there, they would be probably our hottest property, I suppose, in terms of biodiversity, in terms of flora and fauna in Hobson's Bay. If you were to look around in Hobson's Bay, if people were to come to me to say, where do we go to find some animals or some diversity in plants, more often than not, we'd direct them to one of our wetland systems, or at least where there is water. So we oversee about 8, I'll call them stormwater wetlands, if you like, depending on how we view Cherry Lake and the surrounds. It's about 8. And on top of that, there's the 4 creeks, Laverton Creek, Skeleton Creek, Corate Creek, and I'll stay Stony Creek because it runs through Hobson's Bay, but basically the only good part of it is managed by Parks Victoria. The rest is pretty well in Yarraville. I don't have much more to say at the moment, I suppose, on all that, Dom, except that, they're just such a great resource. And again, Darren mentioned about the litter getting from someone's homes or nature strips into our wetland, into our waterways and out into the bay. By having these wetland systems, and the one Darren mentioned, known as Laverton Stormwater Harvesting Project, that's one of the more recent ones. But we've got them, the 8 of them we've got are fairly well spread over the municipality, and I would imagine down the track it'd be really good to get a few more up and on the go, because this one in Laverton, is providing to be, really, really beneficial. It's just a pity that the road keeps flooding all the time, if anyone knows the area.
That'll do for me for the moment, in the wetlands. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
Andrew, what you were saying about wetlands and them being an asset in the community, and I guess in the not too distant past, the water that's coming into those wetlands is, we're dealing with the water from stormwater or from those drain systems, and the natural processes in those wetlands are doing what they can to process the water that's coming through that environment, but that we're also starting to look at the model of how a wetland operates, and creating those artificial wetlands like the stormwater one in Laverton, and how they increasingly become assets for the community as well. And that also then becomes a responsibility for council to manage them as an asset landscape.
And I think people are realising that now, Dom, word's starting to get out, and like the wetland centre there, like that's proposed to be on 2 of the best, well, certainly apart from Werribee treatment plant, in terms of wildlife, bird spotting and stuff like that. Like that's virtually position A1 there, and people are starting to realise that it's no longer just an old swamp where the stormwater used to just run out, but now it is a really, really significant area. We're getting birds from Alaska, Siberia, Tasmania, all over the place, popping over to visit us basically now that when I say we never used to, I mean, I'm sure we did, but probably not in the numbers we've got now.
And I think the connectedness of those landscapes is really important. So we're realising the value in those assets, and also the value in connecting them together, taking a broader view on them as well. Thank you so much.
Can I just add a point to this section of Laverton Creek? When at Melbourne Water about 8-9 years ago, this section of Laverton Creek was probably a really low socioeconomic area. It was full of rubbish dumping, hoon behaviour, drug paraphernalia, and it was a bit of a no-go zone. So I think public safety was probably a bit of an issue there. To see this section of Laverton Creek as a really high-profile park for community, that behaviour has now changed. You don't see the rubbish dumping as much. I'm sure it does go on in certain areas. I'm not actually in that space now, but I suppose you could say the social uplift as a result of this wetland for Hobson's Bay is probably tenfold. And the idea of these sports ovals connecting to stormwater encourages people to get active through sport. And I think there's a whole health benefit aspect to it as well. And to see the change in that section on what's the name of that road, Andrew, between the baseball centre and Merton Street, is it? Time. So to see it change, that's what it does. It actually transforms the social aspect of these communities.
Yeah, great. So lots of reasons to keep facing stormwater and to explore the benefits that it can have for waterway health, but also for the human health around those waterways. So thanks for that, Darren. Thanks, Michael and Andrew, for that little bit of clarification for us to understand what stormwater is in our urban context. I'm going to build on what Penny asked the question in the chat, but the next part of what I'd like to explore is the impacts of those volumes of water moving across the urban landscape. By the nature of their movement, they pick up all sorts of things along the way, and that definitely puts pressure on the waterway. And I think there are some spots where we can see that that happens quite profoundly. So I'd like to ask Nick to talk about his involvement in one element of stormwater treatment, and that is the gross pollutant traps. And can you tell us a bit about the impacts of being involved in that, what you noticed being part of that, and the impact that it has on waterways, Nick?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dom. I got involved in gross pollutant traps, part of the Wader Beach litter project. By gross, we mean large, not revolting.
Disgusting, sorry.
So that's disgusting. We talk about things like plastic bottles, large plastic bags, polystyrene coming from developments and so on. Hobson's Bay, when I started the project of looking at the gross pollutant traps, it gave me a map showing 24 traps, which were designed to take this big litter out of the stormwater system before they got into the bay. Actually, I couldn't find 8 of them, and 3 were sealed. So I'm assuming the sealed ones were just dealing with sediment. But for the others were quite sophisticated traps with fairly coarse mesh caused by pipe grids, and sumps to get some of the sediment out. And if you're quite welcome to go and look at them, they're all over the place. If you look in them, you'll find that they are doing the job. They are trapping things like tin cans, polystyrene bottles, and the various stuff that gets washed down by the stormwater. There are at least 3 simpler stormwater drains, which just have a net over the end. And I went around on a more recently just to see what was happening there. And at Nottler Dam, they've now put a net over that one. In fact, I think they put about 3 nets across it because there are 3 outlets all at the one point. The thing about gross pollutant traps is that they take the large litter out of the system. They do have some drawbacks though. One is once they've taken it out of the system, it stays in the trap. So someone has got to come around on a regular basis and take it out. If they don't, it builds up and you get a backlog. And without fail, all of the gross pollutant traps that I looked at, they have a fail-safe system, which means when they're blocked, any water coming down backflows and actually empties the trap. So if it's full of plastic bottles and a storm comes in, then most of those plastic bottles will then get washed out of the trap. And because the water is so high, they end up in the swale. And the swale is actually the bit that goes on the downstream side of the trap into the river or whatever it is you're trying to protect. And you can see signs that this has happened in the past. Most of our swales are protected because they're full of Phragmites reeds. So the large litter gets trapped there. That's not the end of the story though, because if that litter stays there long enough, it'll break down into smaller parts. And those smaller parts will actually get washed away. So not only is it important that we maintain these traps and get them empty as soon as there's any litter in them at all, really, before the stuff breaks down. Otherwise, all we're doing is actually holding the gross pollutants until they become micro pollutants and end up everywhere. Yeah, I think that's about all I wish to say on it. I'm quite happy to deal with questions later.
Thanks, Nick. It's really interesting you saying that. It's almost just like a holding point until it either becomes a bigger problem and gets flushed over, or breaks down and becomes a smaller but still impactful problem.
Correct. Yeah. In fact, even a bigger problem when it's smaller.
When it's smaller, correct. Yeah. I'm wondering, whose responsibility was it to empty them? The infrastructure and the emptying, are they managed by the same people in your experience?
No, I think there were some traps we looked at that definitely were owned by Melbourne Water. I don't know if they've passed the maintenance on to council. And the rest of them, I'm assuming, are council, because council did give me the original map.
Process with the EPA was great. And we made a short film called Baykeepers. And in that film, we introduced beach patrol, which there had been a couple of chapters already established around the top part of the bay. And once the film was screened around other municipalities, within a short space of time, going from 3 beach patrol chapters, they had 20. And that's basically local postcode groups that had established when they saw that film. And that was an outcome of a collaboration between government and community, which I thought was a great success. But collaborations are not easy to actually nurture, though, because there's a wide range of organisations going from state government to local government, down to research institutes. You need that expertise to actually really get good scientific detail. And also there's local community groups, obviously, who are working on their patch. And industry organisations too are required, particularly in relation to plastic pollution and polystyrenes, for example. And everyday people, if we don't have the general community sort of connected and really appreciating and seeing how their lifestyle choices can impact on the quality of the waterways, then we're still going to be struggling. So there's a lot of links to tie in there to create what the ultimate goal for us all would be. And I think, though, that regional not-for-profit groups, in my experience, have got an opportunity to actually help to create those collaborations, because we have the freedom to actually talk beyond municipal boundaries and beyond sort of sectoral interest groups, you know. So most government organisations have got their business plan and their core goals that they have to achieve, whereas community organisations and not-for-profits can actually transcend a few of those things and come up with some creative ideas and approaches that might actually lead to positive collaborations. So I'll probably leave it at that for now.
Thanks very much, Neil. That's some really interesting things that you raised there, the power of working together and how it can activate the community, like you were saying with the beach patrol groups, that awareness and working together then makes other people more aware of what's going on and getting involved. But then,
if I could just add to that, Beach Patrol in recent years have actually established a Love Our Streets component. So we've realised that it's not the end point it's not the litter on the beach where we need to focus our energies, although that's important, but it has to be addressed at the street level. And so that's what relates to all of the stormwater issues. If it's the surrounding catchments to the stormwater need to be managed well.
Thank you. And I think the other thing you were saying there about the power of a not-for-profit in bringing together all those organisations that have their own remits but definitely have the capacity to collaborate when they're called together for a particular project is a really interesting point too. And like you were saying, I think a wetland organisation also has that power to look upstream to see what else could we be doing further away from where we are, not just dealing with it in that wetland setting.
Yeah, and I guess the other thing too that I'd mentioned about the not-for-profit groups is we have the ability to actually attract funding from philanthropic sources, which might not be available to government agencies. So we can actually bring in some extra resourcing to actually achieve those sort of projects.
Yeah, great. Ooh, magical capacity of the not-for-profit in this area. I love it. Thank you, everybody on the panel, for sharing and giving us a little bit of an insight into stormwater. And I think we're only just opening up now what the complexity of it and the opportunities that there are for us. And also thank you for your patience with our little bit of gross pollutant interruption there. It's a pleasure always to share these kinds of conversations, but I'd like to open it up now to members of the audience who do have things that they'd like to get a better understanding of. I have had one question from the chat that I'd like to ask you, and that's from Sandra. Do members of the panel think that one of the regulatory frameworks, like the Planning and Environment Act, is adequately future focused to improve regulation and water resource management? And do you think it's time for a review?
Can I mention something there?
Of course.
One of the problems is that you might have these regulations in place, and they mean well, but one of the problems is that its actual implication of on-ground works. For example, I had several representatives of one of the councils in the lab, and the feedback from the council was, who does what? Who does what? They didn't know. There seems to be some confusion between the size of a wetland and who is responsible for it. There seemed to be whose role it was to do what and where the funding was coming from. They didn't have a clue.
Right. It seems to fit with your map, Nick, even just for one little element of it, the gross pollutant traps and who is responsible for the elements of that. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, look, one of the things about infrastructure, well, rules and regulations, is they're all very well and good, but someone has got to actually enforce them.
Yes,
I think that the major problem that I saw with the traps was they need money to maintain them. It's quite a sexy proposition to put in the infrastructure. It tends not to be so exciting to do the repetitive maintenance work. I think we've probably got all the legislation we need. I think it's just a matter of actually putting feet on the ground to enforce it.
yes, and not another survey.
Not an yes.
Can I just say, in defence of the water utilities, I spent 7 years with Melbourne Water, based at the Brooklyn Pump Station. We had TEAS as our contractor. We had crews that did natural resource management on ground, so supporting councils to get waterway health improved, so vegetation, including wetlands, but also the civil crew we had. This is going back 8 years ago now. I'm assuming it's either improved. Hoping it's improved, and we would have monthly inspections of all assets we owned in the Werribee and the Maribyrnong catchments in the west, and these GPTs were inspected and cleaned. Look, to be honest, they weren't the best designed assets that were put in probably 30, 40, 50 years ago, but they were removing a lot of debris from these assets that were coming from upstream. And I have photos to prove that crews were out there on a regular basis. The best asset was under Crown Casino, that everyone wanted to go into that pit because it was always full of money. And the deal was, those who went down there, if you found cash, they could share it with everyone.
Everyone's inspiration for picking up litter as well.
Absolutely, but I can vouch for Melbourne Water did have a very stringent, we had program maintenance done on a monthly, 6 monthly, yearly basis, depending on the size of the asset. And I can say clearly the definition between an asset and a catchment is, if it's above 60 hectares, it's Melbourne Water's responsibility. If it's below 60 hectare catchment, it's council's responsibility. That's gazetted. So that you want a bit of clarity on that, Rob? And so the idea would be to take it back to council and to Melbourne Water and say, okay, where we have the biggest issues, let's try and resolve it.
Yep. It took me 2 years to find that out from the council, and it was you who told me.
Okay.
But I think what you're all saying here is highlighting the complexity of waterway management. And, you know, even Darren, what you were saying, it was Melbourne Water managing, but you also had contractors doing that work. So the group of people involved becomes much broader. It's easy to think of it as a simple issue when it's actually far more complex than that.
I could say if you recruit the right staff on your crews, you get passionate people who want to make a difference. And that just helps. They go above and beyond what's expected.
Yep.
One of the other issues of pollutants is road assets.
Yes.
What happens is when there's all the toxicants from road, rubber, steel,
cadmium, lead, zinc,
all go straight into a drain, which then goes straight into a waterway. So in a high rainfall event, every time you'll kill a creek for 6 months with all those high pollutants that go straight into a waterway. If there's a fuel spill on a waterway, it goes straight into the drain, straight into the waterway. And they call Melbourne Water to get the crews out to put booms across the creek. The creek's already dead. And so it needs a higher level management system to say when we redesign our new roads, like the Westgate Tunnel Road, for example, it needs to have an infrastructure designed to store that pollutant in their asset until they can deduct it out. And then say then turning on a valve and flushing it into the waterway. It's like, hang on, you're removing the responsibility of an agency. It's one of my bugbears, actually.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. We have more questions from the audience, but something that I noted for us to talk about is who's missing from this conversation today. Not that I'm directly asking you, but just something to keep in mind. One question I did want to come to that kind of builds on this is from Jackie, and it's for you, Rob. Where does the phosphorus come from?
It comes from a wide variety of household products. For example, fertilizer used in the gardens, household products such as detergents, etc. They all get washed down into the stormwater drains or into house pollutants, etc. And they all end up in wetlands or stormwater treatment plants.
Right. So from a range of sources and end up in a
range of sources, yeah. So anyone who's buying detergents or stuff, just look on the packaging, see how much phosphorus is in there, and buy the least expensive. Sorry, the least one with the least content.
Fabulous. And I think you actually lead perfectly into a question that we're going to close with, and that is from Sandra. What is one meaningful thing that an individual can do to make a difference? And I think, Rob, you've answered with phosphorus, but I'm wondering, Neil or Nick or Darren, Michael, Andrew, what's a meaningful thing that an individual can do to make a difference?
I'll add my 2 bobs worth. The stormwater harvesting project, so empowering councils to put stormwater harvesting systems on for irrigating their open spaces. What that does, that diverts stormwater from going straight into a waterway into the bay. By diverting that stormwater and putting it through an ultraviolet treatment system or a natural wetland system, what it does, it actually holds back the phosphorus and nitrogen, and which is just taken up through the environment rather than straight into a waterway. So I'd say stormwater harvesting is a really good initiative.
And is that something an individual can ask their councillor about?
Yep.
Yep, great. Thanks, Darren.
Darren, I'd second that as well. I think that's where we're really starting to move. We realise that it's, like I mentioned before, it's actually a volume reduction discussion as well. It's not what's in the water per se. If we can capture the water, reuse it, actually take it out of the system, be it used for residential or industrial uses as well, and then obviously goes into the sewage system or for irrigation as such. We're actually dealing with multiple sources of issues at that point. And what we're really pushing hard with the state government as well and the EPA as well is to really look at new standards where we actually require that of new development. So it sort of goes to that question around your Planning Environment Act and the obligations of different entities under that. Well, what can we do at a local scale? So the local planning provisions, if they're guided through state government, the state government planning scheme, that's what we're trying to influence at the moment. So I'm getting a little bit into the detail there. But what we're doing now is actually really quite a shift on what has been required of stormwater management over the last 15 to 20 years. At the moment, there's an awful lot of energy at the moment. It's actually mind-boggling how much is going on at the moment, but it will take time to implement and for industry to accept and actually adapt to that as well. And so a lot of it's very much learning by doing at the moment in that regard. So I hope that helps provide a little bit of context in that way. But what Darren said around stormwater harvesting, we're absolutely wedded to that idea at the moment, that is one of the absolute key ways of addressing this issue, both from a flow perspective and a water quality perspective as well.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Neil or Nick, did you want to add anything?
From my point of view, it'd be nice to get this cash for containers off the ground in Victoria. It seems to have stalled again. It's very disappointing, I think. Looking from my experience, the plastic bottles seem to be really dominant out there. Make them valuable, make our rubbish valuable, make it worthwhile people returning it. That's what I would like.
Great.
Yeah, I could add to that, Nick. I worked on the road patrol with Kerrang Shire back in the 1970s, and one of the road patrollers up there used to collect bottles when we had cash for container, and he paid his car registration every year with it. So and just another anecdotal thing, we had a project with Scouts Victoria where they were doing street litter audits at various street usages around right around the bay a couple of years ago, and they found that most of the things that were ending up as chewed up microplastics were single-use takeaway items and bottle tops and that sort of thing. If those things had been picked up by a local kid who wanted to buy a basketball because they could get some money for it, then they wouldn't have been mowed over and turned into microplastics. So it's actually getting a review of our understanding of the value of water and its importance in our lives and for the whole of nature, and also the value of other single-use things that are just sort of thrown away and disregarded.
I think it's really interesting what you've all highlighted, as there's individual choice in a lot of those things, but there's also the power of the individual to put pressure on the systems that can make those things happen, that we do have a container deposit scheme and that we are investing more in seeing stormwater as a resource rather than an issue. We've come to the end of our time. I can see there's a little bit of chat going on in the chat area. I'm going to leave people to do that amongst themselves. But Marilyn, as the director, would you like to take yourself off? I'm not sure if you're with us on the cameras. Yeah, there you are.
Hi everyone, I'm the chair of the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre, and it's just been my pleasure to listen to you all. What a wonderful discussion to recognise World Wetlands Day that was earlier this week. When you can't go out meeting face to face and have an open day, get together on Zoom despite its little glitches and discuss really important things. This stormwater discussion that you've just touched on, and it's been great, a wonderful panel of people from diverse backgrounds talking about it. We could probably talk for hours on this, and I do hope that the Wetlands Centre will have future Zoom presentations like this where we can explore other aspects of stormwater. So I'd like to thank the panel very much for spending their time with us and encourage you to spend more time with the Hobsons Bay Wetlands Centre to join us and participate in future activities. And then a special thank you to Dominique, who has arranged this and facilitated what is a very complicated conversation. And we're all coming at it from different areas. So well done, Dominique. It's been such an interesting time. And so I'll thank you all for attending. And just on that last note, as some of you will know, that going back in the day, my passion has been for litter projects and other things. That's where I first met the Baykeeper. And I look forward to having more of them in the future. But I think Sandra's right, the take-home message, what can we do as individuals? Well, there's plenty of things to join. There's Jodie's beach patrol, other beach patrols around, there's street things. Was it Love Our Streets? There's boomerang bags, there's all sorts of things. So I encourage people both as organisations to continue the great work on stormwater and stormwater harvesting into the future, and to individuals to do what they can, not to have that extra plastic bottle takeaway cup and all those other things. And it's been difficult during the pandemic, I must admit, to try to get your keep cup used at a cafe. So I just want to end this saying thank you so much on behalf of the Hobsons Bay Wetland Centre for attending. Our next activity is a workshop on the 26th of February, which is going to be another fascinating presentation from Gordon Lazinski. Watch our Facebook, watch our website, and hear what we're doing. Thanks.